Hi, Craig.
Hi, Craig.
Hey, Craig.
Hey, Craig.
Hey, Craig.
And hello, everyone. Welcome to the paddock. On this episode, we're going to be spotlighting a Canadian driver, Lance Stroll. And this is just in time for the Canada Grand Prix this weekend. Now, while he's only been on the track since 2017, Formula One track, we do get to do a little deep dive in his karting days and how he ended up on the grid. Today, we have myself, Chelsea, we have Ida, Casey, and we have Rachel and LeAnne on the episode. And we're going to start off with Rachel, who has a quick little intro for his family and background.
Lance Stroll is a Canadian-Belgian driver and was born on October 29th, 1998 in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. He is a Scorpio. His last name is actually Strolovich, and he is of Russian Jewish descent through his father's side. His mother is Belgian fashion designer Claire Anne Callan, and his father is Canadian businessman Lawrence Stroll. While he does hold both Canadian and Belgian citizenship, he races under the Canadian flag. He is multilingual, speaking English, French, Flemish, and Italian. And I'm going to pass it over to Casey to tell you about his karting career and time in F4.
Now, I had to really dig deep into the depths of the internet for this karting info. Wasn't the easiest to find, but it all kind of starts with his father being a huge motorsport enthusiast. He even owned for a while. I think he recently sold it. The Circuit Mont Tremblant racetrack in Quebec, and that's kind of where Lance grew up. A lot of the time racing there. He had exposure to racing early on, and since his father has such a large car collection, he even used to race some of his Ferraris. Funnily enough, using the number 18, which we now know is Lance's number, so perhaps that was a bit of inspiration for him choosing that. And he actually received his first kart as a birthday present when he was around 5, and he would actually cart around cones in the parking lot of the track that his father owned. So just, growing up, carting around parking lots. He began to compete regionally in 2008 at age 9 and started off very strong. He won the 2008 Canadian National Karting Championships in the Rotax Micro Mini division against some names that actually might sound familiar to some IndyCar fans, as he competed against Pato O'Ward and Devlin DeFrancesco, who are currently IndyCar drivers. Lance also wins the 2008 Coup de Quebec and Coup de Montreal in the Micro Max division. The Fédération Sport Automobile du Québec nominated Lance as Rookie of the Year for his stellar performance. Quickly becoming known as a Canadian karting prodigy, his father arranges for him to be tutored by 6-time world karting champion Mike Wilson in 2009. Wilson was initially skeptical of Lance's motivation due to his wealthy background, but quickly changed his mind after watching him race, stating, "Instead, when I saw him on the track, I realized that his father had his reasons and that this was a special child with something more than others. Above all, I was surprised by his determination. It was greater than normal. And this is strange, because boys who come from such wealthy families generally do not need to struggle to get anything. Consequently, they are not very determined. Not him. Quite the contrary. Before him, the last boy I had seen with his willingness was Fernando," referring to Fernando Alonso. And there's actually a weird coincidence that I kind of discovered while researching this, is that about 10 years prior, Mike Wilson was back in North America for the 1998 North American Karting Championships with the young Fernando Alonso. But the weird part was actually the date. So this karting competition took place from October 28th to November 1st, 1998, which just so happens to be when Lance was born. So his future teammate and future karting mentor were actually racing in the same time zone when he was born, which I thought was kind of a fun coincidence. In 2009, Lance heads down to Florida for his first international competition. He takes second at Florida Winter Tour Rotax Micro Max division, just behind Logan Sargent, who was in first, and ahead of Pato O'Ward in third, and Devlin DeFrancesco in fourth. And fellow familiar racing names David Malukas and Enzo Fittipaldi were also competing. So a lot of familiar names in the North American karting circuit. Lance continues on to get 7th in the ROK Cup International Final Mini ROK division, and second in the Canadian National Karting Championships Rotax Mini Max. And he again gets first in the Coup de Montreal and the Coup de Quebec Mini Max. And this year's performance earns him the 2009 Driver of the Year in Quebec. In 2010, Lance continues to win and do well in North America, but his racing wasn't the highlight of this year. The highlight would be when he signed at only 11 years old to be part of the newly formed Ferrari Driver Academy, which is actually the same year that Alonso joined Ferrari. This is also when you can see a picture of when he was signed. He's actually took the picture with two of his future F1 teammates, Felipe Massa and Fernando Alonso. So this is actually pretty huge for 11-year-old Lance, as it provides a lot of mentoring and support with a current Formula One team, Ferrari, but it also more crucially would help Lance break into the more competitive European karting circuit. 2011 is his first year karting in Europe, and the competition is a lot more fierce. I mean, he's racing against, George Russell, Esteban, Charles, and Max. So current competitors. But he still manages to hold his own, the highest place of eighth, and is a solid upper middle of the pack this season that's pretty competitive with about 30 racers. It was hard to adjust to a new continent, new languages, and some really rough competition. And he was only 12. He was able to find his feet a bit more in 2012 with a second place finish at the 23 Trofeo Andrea Margutti KF3, fourth at the WSK Master Series, and finally, a first place win at the MG Tires SKUSA Super Nationals, which took place in Las Vegas. And if you've been paying attention to the Las Vegas F1 race promotions this year, he actually mentions about beating George Russell in one of their promo videos. And 2013, more karting, nothing really of note happened, but he advances to the KF karting division. During the winter of 2014, the Ferrari Driver Academy organizes the inaugural and only season of the Florida Winter Series, which consists of 12 races over 4 race meetings. This was Lance's debut into single-seater racing and was an opportunity to learn before competing officially. He took pole in one of the races, was on the podium twice with the highest position of P2, and was fourth 3 times with the lowest position of P7. All in all, a great performance for his first time in a single-seater. This racing series also gave Lance the chance to compete among the likes of Nicholas Latifi, who won 4 of the races in this series, Max Verstappen, who won 2 of the races, and Will Buxton. Yes, everyone's favorite F1 journalist and star of Drive to Survive was actually Lance's garage mate for the Palm Beach races. This might be why Lance seemed so comfortable talking to him on Will's grid walk right before the 2023 Monaco Grand Prix. Throughout his racing career, Lance has been pretty harshly judged based on his background before people even got a chance to know him or see him race. Will Buxton admitted on his blog that even he misjudged Lance at first. He describes how at first he thought Lance was a typical teenage boy, karting graduate nightmare, late to meetings, messing around on the phone. But after spending time with his garage mate, his opinions changed about Lance, stating that Lance was generally a lovely guy, still so young at 15, and blisteringly quick. Supportive of his boys in the garage, a smart brain, and ever so confident. Confident to the point that if you don't know him, you'd think he was being arrogant, just as I had before I really knew him. Unfortunately, media has not been kind to Lance during his racing career, mainly due to his family background. He's even had to turn off comments on some of his social media due to an overwhelming amount of hateful messages, which is really unfortunate to see kind of cyberbullying in, this modern era, and especially to the point where you have to kind of like shut down your social media almost. But Lance is pretty well aware of the negativity. He's, said that before, and he said that he tries to ignore it and focus on the positives, spending time with his close family and friends and just kind of racing the best he can. And so he continues on racing. So in 2014, the Formula Abarth series is replaced with Formula 4, a regional series. And not much changes about the cars, as Tata still builds the chassis and a detuned 160 horsepower 1400cc Fiat FPT engine is still used in the cars. Lance participated in the inaugural Italian Formula 4 Championship with Prima Power Team. He dominates this season, taking pole 5 times, winning 7 races, and finishing on the podium 13 times. He easily wins the championship, 94 points above his closest competitor, which is even more impressive knowing that he had to actually miss the last 3 races due to having an injury. During the season, Lance learns how to adjust his driving style and habits that he developed in go-karts to driving cars. Lance has described his driving style as being reactive, focusing on the feel of the car and adapting in the moment versus poring over data, meditating, or other styles that drivers may choose. I highly recommend watching or listening to Lance's interview with fellow Canadian and stock car racer Gary Clutt. It's super casual, and you get to see a different side to Lance than what you typically see from the standard F1 media, and you get to learn more about him, his life, and his path to F1. Chelsea will talk more about that path and what series Lance raced in next after winning F4.
So, like Casey was saying, he did end up having a little stint in something called the Toyota Racing Series. So, what is the Toyota Racing Series? Well, now it's known as the Formula Regional Oceania Championship. This series is for young drivers like Lance Stroll in 2015, and it gave them the chance to experience and drive cars with carbon fiber composite chassis, some aerodynamics, and slick tires. And we also had a favorite Lando Norris compete in this. Now, in 2015, the series was run by Toyota, hence the name, and this was because the drivers were using Toyota four-cylinder engines and Michelin tires. Now, the event hosted 16 races at 5 different meets, and Lance Stroll had an amazing year in this series, to be honest. I mean, he won 3 of the 4 races that season and consistently finished all of the races. There was not one DNF. And it was the last race of the season, so this is the New Zealand Grand Prix, where he ended up closing the championship title with another win, his last one, the fourth one. And that ended the season with 10 podium finishes as well. So he was the first Canadian to win this Grand Prix, the Toyota Series. In the same year, we also saw Lance Stroll competing with the Prema Power team on the F3 track. So he did these things back to back. And Ito is actually going to dive in on what happened there.
Yeah, as Chelsea alluded to, 2015 was an eventful year for Lance, as he also competed in Formula 3 European Championships, alongside familiar faces such as Charles Leclerc, Antonio Giovinazzi, who, fun fact, just won the 24 Hours of Le Mans this past weekend, George Russell, and Alex Albon. He chose to compete with Prema that season as his dad had taken a stake in the team at that point in time. He managed to win 1 race at Hockenheim, as well as a total of 6 podium finishes during the 33-race season. These 6 podium appearances were enough to see him finish 5th overall that season, and it also saw his only appearance in Macau, which, while part of the F3 calendar, isn't part of the championship. It is more like an exhibition race, if you will. In Macau, he finished 8th out of 28 drivers, which, considering he didn't have to compete in that race, and it was also his first appearance at that race, it was still a pretty good finish. Because I feel like if you don't have to compete in a race to gain championship points, your heart might not be in it completely. Even though he's decided to leave the Ferrari Drivers Academy at the end of 2015 season because he became a test driver for Williams and hence joined their development team, he would stay with Prema for the 2016 F3 season, which, considering they historically had strong ties to Ferrari and the Ferrari Drivers Academy, is a bit unusual, but definitely not unheard of, as Prema attracts top talent from all different types of driver development programs. So 2016 rolls around, and just as in 2015, Lance did a mix of different racing series that year, doing endurance racing as well as F3. Starting off with the 24 Hours of Daytona, which he managed to finish 5th in, which, considering it was his first endurance race, is no small feat, as endurance racing is very different to F1, F2, or even F3, with which he had experience. In terms of F3 that year, he won his first race in France and went on to winning a total of 14 races out of the 30 races that season, which would make him the F3 champion by the end of the year, an impressive 187 points ahead of Maximilian Gunther in P2. Though some would say that it wasn't a fair fight for the title that season, as oftentimes team orders were invoked throughout the season, which just goes to show that, again, F3 wasn't really kind to him in terms of the naysayers.
So moving on to 2017, like Ito said, he was a test driver for Williams. He ended up signing with Williams for the 2017 F1 season. He actually skipped F2 and joined Williams Formula One team, kind of like how Max skipped F2 as well. His partner was Felipe Massa that year, and he was the first Canadian F1 driver since Jacques Villeneuve, who won the 1997 World Drivers' Championship. He actually crashed in practice for his debut race, the Australian Grand Prix, and this resulted in a grid penalty since the crash necessitated an unscheduled gearbox change. But ultimately, he ended up retiring from the race due to a brake failure. He also retired from the Chinese Grand Prix due to a collision with Sergio Perez, and then again in Bahrain due to a collision with Carlos Sainz Jr. The first race finish he had that year was the Russian Grand Prix, and he finished in 11th place. He ended up retiring with another brake failure in Monaco, though, but he still got classified as 15th. His first points in F1 were scored at his home Grand Prix in Montreal, where he finished 9th. And I love this. I think that just had to have been so special for him to get his first points in F1 at his home race. I feel like it's adorable. His first podium came in Azerbaijan, where he finished 3rd after being passed by Valtteri Bottas just meters from the finish line. With the 3rd place finish, Lance actually became the 2nd youngest driver and the youngest rookie to finish on the podium at 18 years, 239 days. During a wet qualifying session for the Italian Grand Prix, he had the 4th fastest time, but ended up starting 2nd on the grid due to Daniel Ricciardo and Max Verstappen getting grid penalties. So this made him the youngest F1 driver to start on the front row. Unfortunately, he finished the race in 7th. He finished 8th at both Singapore and Malaysia. At the former, he started 18th, so he actually made up 10 places in Singapore, which is incredible. But at the latter in Malaysia, he collided with Sebastian Vettel during cooldown lap. Both of them blamed the other for the collision, but the stewards didn't take any action. At the Mexican Grand Prix, he finished 6th after starting in 11th, placing him ahead of his teammate Felipe Massa in the Drivers' Championship for the first time all season. He ended up scoring 40 out of the 83 points for Williams that season, finishing 12th in the Drivers' Championship. A fun fact about that, Lance actually gained more positions during the opening lap than any other driver that season. He remained with Williams for the 2018 season, but this year his teammate was Sergei Sirotkin, since Massa retired after 2017. Unfortunately, that year Williams was the slowest car on the grid, finishing last in the Constructors' Championship. But Lance was still able to score the team's first points at the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, finishing in 8th. At the Canadian Grand Prix that year, he was out on the first lap after a collision with Brendan Hartley from Toro Rosso, and he retired from 2 races, the French GP due to a tire puncture and the German GP due to a brake failure. He only made it into Q3 once that season, qualifying 10th at the Italian Grand Prix. And he ended up finishing 9th with teammate Sirotkin finishing 10th, which was Williams' only double point finish that season. He ended the season 18th in the Drivers' Championship, having scored 6 out of 7 points for Williams. And I'm going to hand it back over to Ito to talk about his move to Racing Point.
I mean, Racing Point is a fun story. If you haven't caught our Aston episode that just released Monday, go listen to that for a bit more background, but I'm going to touch on it briefly now. So, after Force India, now Racing Point was bought by a bunch of investors, including Lance's dad, Lawrence. He started driving for them in 2019. I mean, it was to be expected that he would switch to Racing Point from Williams, as his father literally owns the team, or at least owns part of it. But sadly, again, it didn't help his image, which just hurts my heart, honestly. Thankfully, he was able to quiet the negative voices by scoring the team's first points of the season at the season opener in Australia. Sadly, the rest of the season wasn't as promising as he had hoped after Australia. He narrowly missed out on a podium in Germany, scored 1 point in Spa, and scored his final points of the season in Japan, for a total of 21 points in his maiden season with Racing Point, which meant that he finished 15th in the standings and was behind his teammate Sergio Perez, who finished 10th. 2020, he was off to a weird start, I would say, as a Canadian driver. Canadian Sporting Authority resigned its mandate from the FIA, meaning that there was no longer someone in charge of putting on race events in Canada, and it wouldn't allow racers to drive under the Canadian flag, which meant that Stroll, as well as then rookie Latifi, had to scramble to get a US driver's license in order to get an American super license, which is basically the license that F1 drivers need to drive F1 cars. As thankfully, a deal was struck before ASN Canada resigned from their duties with the FIA so that Canadians could race with an American license, even though during race weekends they would still be referred to as Canadian. It's like this weird combination situation. Researching, it was very hard to find definite information and why it happened. Thankfully, the chaos with the licenses didn't seem to affect him too much throughout the season, as he managed to finish in the points for most races at the start of the season. At one point, he was even fourth in the championship. Sadly, some of those points finishes, as usual, were criticized by other drivers, such as the one at the Styrian Grand Prix, where he overtook Daniel Ricciardo, and Daniel is quoted as saying it was a desperate move and it deserved a penalty. Sadly, even those risky moves, according to some, couldn't stop him from having a string of bad luck, starting with the Tuscan GP, ranging from things like issues with his car, colliding with other drivers, to getting even COVID and having to miss races. He just couldn't catch a break. One would think after taking pole at the Turkish GP, the first Canadian to do so after Jacques Villeneuve in 1997, things would turn around for him. And it did to an extent, as he managed to secure the third podium of his career at Sakir, but it still wasn't enough. After so many DNFs and no point finishes, he managed to finish 10th in standing that season after once again being outperformed by Checo. And as we might know if we listen to the Aston Martin episode, for 2021, he raced for Aston Martin, which Chelsea will talk more about.
So while the team was still known as Racing Point, they ended up rebranding to Aston Martin, and Lance was still in the driver's seat with Sebastian Vettel being brought onto the team. Now, with some new aerodynamic regulations brought onto the circuit from F1, we ended up seeing Lance struggle to get high positions on the circuit. His best spot in 2021 was his sixth place position during the Qatar Grand Prix, which otherwise he had been DNFing or just really finishing below points. There was also a crash that took out Charles and Danny during the Hungarian Grand Prix, which gave Lance a 5 grid penalty at Belgium. But things happen, and he did end up 13th in the Drivers' Championship, which I think, all things considered, really isn't bad. Anyways, the Aston team and Lance, they weren't giving up, and they knew they could make a better car if they just kept working at it. So Lance did end up saying before the season started, we're going to do whatever it takes, within the rules, obviously. And I don't know why he phrased it like that, and it made me laugh, but you know what, Lance? Stay within the rules. Also, if you're a fan of Sebastian or Lance, in 2021, this is when they made that Aston Martin driving video. You guys know the one I'm talking about where they do the drifting and the circle video. If you haven't seen it, please do. It's a must watch. I've seen like 100 edits by now. And in 2022, we get to keep seeing Lance drive with Vettel on the grid. And Aston Martin was working on a new factory that was going to be a home base at Silverstone. Now, Lance is entering his 6th season on the grid. And honestly, this season was tough on the team and the drivers. But what can you do? Lance was even quoted saying, I still feel like I'm not really confident in the car and feeling very precise and just predictable in the car. And that was in June. So Lance ended up having 6 collisions and 3 penalties from those crashes, including a high speed crash with his future teammate Fernando Alonso, who would be joining after Vettel's retirement at the end of the 22 season. And the contract was already set when this crash happened. Now, with the crash, Alonso was a big deal. So it happened in Coda, and Lance had been having an amazing weekend. He even started P5 on race day. Lance hit Alonso so hard that Alonso's car flew up and came crashing back down, thankfully still intact with floor damage. Lance's car, however, was absolutely destroyed. Sadly, the accident might have also been the cause of AM losing their chance for a higher spot in the Constructors' Championship, so that was a hit too. Now, this accident did lead to the Mexico GP, and Lance ended up getting a three grid penalty for the crash. He was able to finish 10th in three consecutive races, and he ended up 15th that season in the Drivers' Championship with only 18 points. But you know what? This is okay because 2023, this is where my hope for the team is finally paying off, okay? Because we have a duo who is surprisingly amazing together. Considering their accident last year, Lance Stroll and Fernando Alonso, they're it. Now, sadly, Lance did miss the three preseason test drives because he was in a cycling accident and that ended up fracturing both left and right wrist, one of his toes, and he got some metal screws in his right wrist because of it. Now, with reserve driver Felipe and Alonso, they were able to keep testing and reviewing the upgrades that Aston Martin was doing for 2023. But Alonso ended up admitting he's like, my comments might not work without Lance here because it would be hard to tell if they're working for him as well as they're working for me and for the reserve driver. Surprisingly and thankfully, Lance was signed off to drive for the Bahrain 2023 Grand Prix. And this was not like a quick recovery. This was him putting 24/7 work and he was just rehab, like going at it. He did admit to being like a little bit discomfortable, not surprising, and he took like a more relaxed approach during the practice races. Technically, he wasn't supposed to be back until like Australia. So they signed him off for the first race. That was a little bit fast. And the way that the FIA tests this, I found out it's like if you're able to race is making sure that you can get out of your cockpit in under 5 seconds in the case of an emergency. So Lance was able to do it when they did the testing. But then at Friday at Bahrain, you can like see videos of him getting help from the team to get out the car. And the team claimed this was just like a precaution, not to overwork his wrist, which thankfully I do get the logic of, but I can see why if you're spectating, you're just kind of like, that's a little sketchy. But you know what? The first race in Bahrain, it was hard on Lance. And with 20 laps left, if you were watching the driver cam, you can like see him take his right hand off the wheel a couple times to try and alleviate the pain. But he did finish in P6, which is absolutely phenomenal considering everything. And he says he actually thinks he could have caught up with Lewis if it hadn't been for the virtual safety car. I mean, I'd give it to Lance. He probably could have. Now, sadly, he did get a DNF in Saudi because of a car issue, and he got another one in Monaco. But you know what? Besides that, this might actually be Stroll's best year yet. So we've had Lance now overtake Alonso, the little radio message, tell Fernando, I will not attack. We are playing the same game. And Alonso doing it right back in Spain, right? And tell Lance not to worry. I just want to build a gap with the cars behind. Which, in honesty, I ended up looking into it because I was like, why would Alonso do that? And it was because Alonso actually feared messing up the floors of the car because he had messed them up during qualifying the day before. And there was only 10 laps left. So he said that to him, sixth and seventh place, they were the same thing to him that day. And he didn't see a point in competing with his teammate and maybe causing an accident that didn't need to happen. I do wonder if Alonso is like this because he's worked in more teammate settings like WEC, and he has a different mindset, I think, from other drivers who are more like gung ho about competing with their teammate. So maybe that's why they're having a more better relationship than, say, Alonso may has had with other drivers in the past because he's complained about Esty Bestie before. And I have really high hopes for 2023 in Lance because he's finally in the top 10 of the driver championship right now. He's sitting at 8 with 8 points, and he's placing in the points almost every race. So if Aston Martin can just keep producing this car that is honestly delivering, and I think if Alonso kind of keeps this mentor relationship with him going, we can finally see Lance hit like these amazing better years in Formula One. Really, at the end of the day, I don't want people to always think of Lance as like an F1 nepo baby or a paid driver. And he's on the circuit, and I feel like this year he's really trying to prove why he should be there. So I just maybe want to see him on podium just one time this season. Maybe this weekend would be a great time to do that if you're listening.
He's our number one listener.
Yeah, it's great that after 7 seasons in F1, and keep in mind he's only 24, so he's been here a while, but he's still pretty young compared to a lot of the rest of the grid. But he's also gotten quite sassy on the radio and in interviews with the infamous quote with his race engineer saying, "The pit confirm button is the OK button, Brad," when trying to communicate with his race engineer about pressing the OK button that is the pit confirm button, as we now all know.
We really truly hope that you enjoyed this episode about our solo Canadian on the grid this year. Let us know your favorite Lance moment in his racing career by reaching out to us on socials. Everywhere is at Paddock Girls Podcast, except for Twitter. You can reach us there by going to at Paddock Girls Pod. Thanks for joining us in the paddock. See you in Montreal. Bye, Craig.
Bye, Craig.
Bye, Craig.
Bye, Craig.
Over and out, Craig.